Dr. Alan Kuperman. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. The screen is yours.
Thanks, James, for that generous, very generous introduction. And I want to thank you and the center and everybody who's helped with the logistics. Today's topic is really timely. Just last week, a major report from China alleged that AUKUS would undermine the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And it called on the International Atomic Energy Agency to block implementation of AUKUS. And just next week, the UN will host the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. That only happens every 5 years, this time 7 years. And at that event, other countries also are expected to criticize Australia and to oppose AUKUS on non-proliferation grounds. Today, I'm going to try to explain that these critics actually have a very good point. But Australia's new Prime Minister, as you mentioned, Anthony Albanese, still has several ways he could modify AUKUS to protect both the non-proliferation regime and Australia's national security. So the title includes this concept of fix AUKUS. Well, what's broken? Here's what. Australia's current plan for AUKUS would undermine a half-century of non-proliferation progress and foster the spread of nuclear weapons to countries and terrorists. That's what's broken. Let me explain why. First, it is necessary to understand that nuclear weapons require one of two materials, either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. If you have one of those, you can build a nuclear bomb, and otherwise not. So, for half a century, the international non-proliferation regime has focused on reducing access to these two materials, including by phasing out all commerce in highly enriched uranium, which we call HEU, and substituting low enriched uranium, we call LEU, which is the fuel in nuclear power plants and which is unsuitable for nuclear weapons. Around the world, 71 nuclear reactors already have converted from HEU to LEU fuel. In addition, for medical isotopes, all of the world's major producers have switched from using HEU to LEU. Even for national security, the US Army has switched its reactors from HEU to LEU fuel, and NASA has switched from HEU to LEU fuel for its planned space reactors. Now, ironically, Australia used to be a leader in this non-proliferation effort. As recently as 2017, Australia signed a UN pledge to, quote, make every effort to achieve further progress with regard to minimizing and eliminating the use of highly enriched uranium in civilian applications, unquote. But now, under AUKUS, Australia would totally reverse course and become by far the world's biggest HEU user of any country that lacks nuclear weapons. The AUKUS submarines would be fueled by tons of 93% enriched uranium, which is drawn directly from the US nuclear weapons stockpile, and which would be sufficient for hundreds of atomic bombs if diverted for that purpose. And this would create a terrible precedent. If Australia not only became the first country without nuclear weapons to acquire submarines, but did so with weapons-grade uranium fuel, then other countries would demand the same right. This could include Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. I could go on. Many of these countries would demand the same right. Some of them really want nuclear submarines, and others would just want the HEU to build nuclear bombs. So if Australia goes ahead with this HEU submarine deal, what could the world say to the other countries to stop them? We could say, well, you don't need nuclear submarines. And they'd say, well, Australia needed them. We could say, well, your submarines don't need HEU fuel. And they would say, well, you said Australia's submarines need HEU fuel. And then we could say, well, we don't trust you as much as we trust Australia, so we won't sell you HEU submarines. Would that solve the problem? No, because then they could just turn around and say, we're going to produce our own HEU. And that would actually be even worse. It would give them a clear path to the nuclear bomb, even if they never built the submarines. And it would make the HEU vulnerable to theft by terrorists for nuclear bombs. As a result, inevitably, AUKUS HEU submarines would foster the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which would undermine both Australian and international security. So, what can your Prime Minister Albanese do? In my view, he has three options to fix this. First, he could decide to stick with conventional rather than nuclear submarines. And there would be some benefits to this. Conventional submarines are less expensive, so you can buy more of them. Modern conventional submarines are actually quieter than nuclear submarines, so they're less detectable by your enemy. And as a result, you can provide greater coastal defense with the same amount of money using conventional rather than nuclear submarines. Now, it's true that conventional submarines have a hard time going all the way to the South China Sea without being detected. But Albanese could say that's actually a good thing, because then we won't be antagonizing China, which has nuclear weapons that it could use in retaliation against us. So that's option one. Second option is that Albanese could ask the US for nuclear submarines fueled instead with low enriched uranium. That would set a positive precedent by showing how countries can get nuclear submarines without the proliferation risk of bomb-grade fuel. It would also diffuse China's criticisms, since Australia and the non-proliferation community could say that LEU submarines were actually reinforcing the non-proliferation norm against HEU. Now, the US government, in fact, has been researching LEU fuel for its own submarines for 7 years, and probably could provide LEU submarines to Australia starting in the 2040s, which is when the AUKUS submarines were expected to begin arriving anyway. But critics could claim that LEU would delay delivery of the submarines potentially. Which leads to the third and final option, and that is that Albanese could, instead of buying US and UK submarines, could buy French LEU submarines. And that would have many advantages, and anybody who wants more detail can look at the Lowy Institute website, where I published an article a couple of weeks ago. But let me just tick off some of the advantages. First of all, France already produces and uses LEU-fueled submarines, so there is no technological risk. Secondly, France could provide LEU submarines to Australia about a decade earlier than the US and UK could provide HEU submarines. So that would help deal with what Australia calls the capability gap, as their existing submarines get old and a bit obsolete. Third, French submarines have a crew size about half that of US submarines. And the French crew size is roughly the same as the existing Australian submarine crew size. So with French submarines, Australia's Navy has a chance of actually staffing them. With US submarines, it's maybe an insurmountable challenge to get enough nuclear-trained sailors to go on the submarines. Another benefit of the French option, and I should point out, I have no financial or other interest in this option except for non-proliferation. But France has jointly produced submarines in the past with other countries, at least 4 other countries. So some of the production's in France, some of the production is in the other countries. So if Australia bought these French nuclear submarines, then a lot of the construction would be in Australia. By contrast, the US has never, ever jointly produced a submarine with another country. And so it's possible some of the construction would be done in Australia, but that would be a new thing for the US and a very sharp learning curve. In addition, the French have experience trying to incorporate the US combat system into their submarines. The deal that you mentioned, James, that Morrison scuttled was for a conventional French submarine with the US combat system. So France has been thinking for years about how to incorporate the US combat system into the French submarine platform. And that means if Australia bought LEU submarines from Australia, they would be fully interoperable with the US Navy, which I know is a major concern for your Ministry of Defense. And then finally, since these French submarines are smaller, they probably would cost less than the US or UK versions. And that leaves extra money for Australia's Ministry of Defense to spend on other technologies that might be equally or more important for the security environment going forward. So those are the three options that Albanese had. And what I would say in summary is that Australia is facing a really momentous decision. Middle-sized countries like Australia don't often affect the course of international relations. But in this case, I believe Australia's choice of submarine fuel could well determine the fate of the global non-proliferation regime.